So we're back with part 2 of the video lecture on the correspondence bias, or fundamental attribution error. And I'll pick up where we left off last time with Kelly's covariation theory. I had to stop in the middle of the lecture last time because after I got through the first row, I was coughing too much. So I took a long break, back a day later, and let's see how we do. So there are 3 pieces of information that an observer looks at when trying to judge somebody else's behavior. That somebody else is called an actor. They're not an actor in the true sense. It's just that they're acting, they're behaving in such a way. They're behaving or observing it. So you have an actor and an observer. So the actor engages in some type of behavior. In this hypothetical, Bob gives a positive film review to a film. We want to find out, is it something about Bob, that is to say something personal or dispositional about Bob, or is it something about the film itself? So if it's something about Bob, then we can't really tell if the film is a good film because Bob likes all films. Whereas if the data that we're getting from this from this actor is such that it lends credence to the film itself being good, then that's a situational explanation for Bob's behavior. In that light, I think it sort of makes sense that distinctiveness is the most important category here. If Bob gives positive reviews to all the films that he sees, then you can't really tell based on his review whether or not any one of those films is particularly good. So that leads us to conclude that Bob has a personal disposition where he likes all films. And it's not very informative in that sense because he'll give a positive review to any film at all. Whereas if Bob never gives a positive film review, then the distinctiveness is high, it's unique to that film, and that would lead us to conclude that the film itself was very good, and that's a situational cause of Bob's behavior. So if Bob likes everything that he ever sees, then that's dispositional. But if Bob doesn't like films generally, but he liked this one, then that's situational. We can also look at consensus in terms of whether or not other people like the film. If few other people like the film, then that's low consensus, and that would in turn lead us to think that there's something about Bob that made him like the film. Whereas if everybody likes the film, that's high consensus, and that would lead us to think that there's something about the film itself, a situational cause, that makes everyone like it. Kind of oddly, the consistency statement here is the same either way. I'm not sure how informative that is. I based this on an example from a textbook, and I've not seen too many different versions of this, and I've never gone to study Kelly's covariation theory firsthand, so I'm not sure if there are other examples that might work better. But you get the idea. We use the information of the behavior in terms of trying to decide whether or not it's something about the person or something about the situation that caused that behavior. Now, as far as the theory goes, it's not that important, but where it leads us is someplace very interesting. So, for Kelly's covariation theory, the information from the previous table is diagnostic in terms of whether the observer will make a personal attribution or a situational one. And there's certain certain predictions that come out of that. So personal attribution, it could be a really bad film, but Bob likes all films, good or bad. Something about Bob. Situational attribution, the film is so good that even someone who doesn't like films will like it. Now, a couple of other researchers, but primarily Jones, They were studying Kelly's covariation theory, and they wanted to examine some of the different possible outcomes. They were interested in expanding the theory, and their main hypothesis was that if a behavior is unexpected, if the behavior that the observer is watching is something that is totally unexpected, then it should be more diagnostic. And I think that makes sense, that if you see somebody doing something that you really did not expect that person to do, because nobody ever does this, or they're endorsing a viewpoint that's very unpopular, then it's got to be more diagnostic of an internal state. So Jones and Davis set out to test this, and they had some surprising results. They had no excuse me. They had no idea that constraining the behavior of the actor would yield interesting results. So imagine this example. If somebody broke into my house with a gun and put the gun to my head and told me, sorry for the grim example, but I feel bad for the person who broke in, because they'd probably catch COVID-19 from me. But just imagine that somebody broke in, put a gun to my head, and forced me to announce that I like 1970s pop music. I really can't stand this stuff, especially Barbra Streisand. Just cannot listen to it. It drives me completely bananas. But if somebody came in and forced me to say that, I would say it. And that's behavior under constraint. So the observer who's seeing this happen should not assume any personal dispositional state indicative of me liking 1970s pop music. They should understand that they need to discount the behavior that they're watching me do, because it's forced. And so when Jones and Davis set up the series of experiments, they wanted a control group to compare the experimental group to, and the control group was set up so that what they expected to see was that if they told participants that the person was forced to behave in a particular way, forced behavior should not be diagnostic of anything. It shouldn't be diagnostic of an internal state. If anything, it should be diagnostic of an external state, that is to say that the person is being forced. And that's not how the results turned out. So they had very surprising results from the series of experiments, and they did not know what to do with it. So if a behavior is unexpected, an observer should be more likely to make a dispositional attribution. But if the behavior is forced, then it's not diagnostic. So they were surprised by a control condition where participants continued to make dispositional attributions even when they were told that the behavior was constrained or forced. And here's something from their paper, from Jones and Davis's paper. Correspondent inferences are those inferences where the inferred dispositions correspond directly to the observed behavior. This implies that the behavior that is freely chosen is more diagnostic of an underlying disposition than is behavior that is forced or constrained. I mean, they expected the forced behavior to be non-diagnostic. And here's a figure showing the results of one of their studies. This is one that's a little bit more famous than the other ones in terms of being represented more frequently in social psychology textbooks. So it's a classic study, but it's classic because they found something they did not expect to find. It's sort of an accident. So participants in this study were given the text of a speech. They had to read the text, and then they had to, after reading the text, they had to answer a question as to whether or not they thought that the person who wrote the speech was for or against the position in the speech. And the speech itself was about Fidel Castro. Now this is 1967, shortly after the Bay of Pigs invasion, just a few years after, in which the United States was deeply, deeply, deeply humiliated after a failed invasion of Cuba. And today, I visited Cuba a couple years ago, and to this day, remnants of the battle that was fought at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba are held as sort of war trophies for propaganda value. They even have a tank in Havana proudly displayed with a photograph of Fidel Castro on top of the tank, and there's a propaganda message that says that this is the tank that Fidel Castro captained and gunned when he fired the gun that sank the troop ship in the bay. Of course, Castro wasn't at the scene of the battle, but for propaganda purposes, they tell the people that he was. At any rate, so we can rest assured that in the United States in the 1960s, the average sentiment about Castro was very negative. So I put this red line here as my estimate of where this college population, this is at Duke University in North Carolina, where the attitude should be, maybe even a little bit lower. Now, if you read an essay that somebody wrote that's anti-Castro, and if everybody agrees in the United States, except for a few people in Florida, perhaps, who are Cuban, and we're talking about the 1960s, of course, not today. If everybody agrees in an anti-Castro sentiment, then it's safe to assume that the person who wrote the essay is anti-Castro. So one of the predictions is that if the essay writer had choice in how to write the essay, whether to write it pro-Castro or anti-Castro, then it's safe to go along with the anti-Castro messages being that person's internal state, that is to say, the person's disposition. And also, if the person had no choice in it, it's fairly safe to assume that the person is anti-Castro. Even if they had no choice, we make that assumption because the baseline is so low. Nobody likes Castro in college campuses in the 1960s. I guess, there might be a few communist radical students, but there weren't that many at that time, maybe a few years later. So this anti-Castro is non-diagnostic, but that doesn't matter. That's not part of the prediction. The prediction is that when somebody writes something that's unexpected, it should be more diagnostic. So if somebody writes something that's pro-Castro, unexpected, and they had choice, then it's safe to assume that that person really is pro-Castro. And that makes sense. But if the person had no choice and was told by the debate coach that they had to write a pro-Castro essay, this behavior should be non-diagnostic. This line right here should be down here. This should be a flat line, the solid line where the participants are told that the essay writer had no choice. It should be a flat line. It should go along around the red line here. It should be a flat line because behavior under forced conditions is non-diagnostic in terms of an internal state. But that's not what we see. Now, the level of inferring a disposition is lower than for the choice condition, but it's still surprisingly high. That is to say, a lot of the subjects, but not all of the subjects, a lot of the subjects were making an inference that the a person who wrote the pro Castro speech under forced conditions actually really did like Castro. And Jones and Harris were unable to explain this. Jones did a series of different experiments with different co-authors. This particular paper has, I think, 4 different experiments. I'll do one more of them. So here's one that shows the same pattern. College students in the 1960s were, generally speaking, anti-segregation. They were in favor of desegregation. They were in favor of desegregation. So the anti-segregation or desegregation perspective is, at that point in time, very common among college students, even in North Carolina. and so this is your baseline down here. If a person goes to write an essay that's anti-segregation, you read the essay, and you're told that the person had choice in it, then of course the inference that you make is that the essay writer is anti-segregation. And there's no problem there. If the person who wrote the essay has no choice in the matter and is told that they have to write an anti-segregation essay, then again, there's no problem, because if you're inferring that the person is anti-segregation, that fits the baseline. With no other information, if you just took the average college student at that time, it would be a safe bet that that person was anti-segregation. The shame of this is that I'm going to have to record these over again after I'm fully recovered from COVID-19. But the show must go on. So, if a person writes a pro-segregation essay, that is unexpected among college students at that time in American history. Except maybe, in the very, very deep South, Alabama or something, among some college students. But generally speaking, this is the unexpected direction of the essay. Now, if a person has choice and they write the unexpected essay, then that should be very diagnostic of their disposition. And we see the ratings of the subjects go way up, as predicted by Jones's theory. But in the no choice condition, again, it should be down here. It should be flatlining along the baseline, which is where the red is. But that's not what we see. We see people making dispositional attributions even when they're told that the person had no choice. Now, Jones was very puzzled by this pattern of results, and he did a lot of different experiments trying to test it out, trying to figure out what the heck is going on here. Why are people making dispositional attributions when they're told that the person was forced to write the speech? There was even one experiment where the participants were told that the person who's giving the speech is simply writing, or rather simply reading, a speech that somebody else wrote. Even when the subjects are told that it's not the person's speech, they're just reading it, they still tend to make dispositional attributions. It's just mind-boggling. Why would people do that? And so, after some years of this, in the 1960s and into the 1970s, this weird finding that nobody could figure out was called the fundamental attribution error, where people, it was thought, tended to make these dispositional attributions, and people were trying to, researchers were trying to figure out why this happened. One sort of simplistic explanation is the behavior engulfs the field explanation, that if you see somebody do something, you just automatically believe it. But that's not really a theory. That doesn't fully satisfy our need to know the why. why is it that this happens? It's just an explanation of it happening. So this goes on like this as a mystery for quite a number of years. And this fundamental attribution error, just defying all attempts to give in to some kind of theoretical explanation, Jones gives up on it, and it just remains a mystery for a number of years. Jones even published an article in 1979 called "The Rocky Road from Acts to Dispositions," explaining his frustration with the failure of the results to fit any kind of a theory. Just could not figure it out. So it was a theoretical anomaly, and it was one of the biggest, most interesting areas of social psychology that had not been explained at that time. The subjects were inferring dispositions from acts that they saw somebody do, even when the acts themselves are non-diagnostic, because the actor is forced to do them. And even when they're told about the situational constraints prior to reading the essay. So if you're told that the person has no choice about what they're saying before you even hear them say it, then you should be set up to discount the information, but still they do it. Still they fell into the fundamental attribution or making dispositional attributions. So why would they do this? The giant mystery. So recall earlier from part 1 of this video lecture, the research by Dan Gilbert and his colleagues, Kroll and Malone, unbelieving the unbelievable. These researchers showed that the mind has a tendency to automatically accept new information and only unaccept it when there is evidence showing that it should be unaccepted, showing that it's wrong. But even when we have evidence that something is bullshit, that doesn't mean that the person is going to be motivated to go through the necessary steps to unbelieving it. We are not fully rational beings that Descartes envisioned us to be. If we apply the Spinozan model of the mind, and if you recall how the Spinozan model works, when you encounter new ambiguous information, you accept it as being true until later, at which time, if you're so motivated, then you can, although Spinoza didn't really talk about the motivation part, but until later when you critically analyze it rationally, and if it needs to be unaccepted, then you can unaccept it. So the Spinoza model fits here nicely. If we apply the Spinoza model to the fundamental attribution error, it starts to make sense. The observer sees the target say something or do something. The observer sees the actor's behavior. The observer assumes the behavior is freely chosen and makes the dispositional attribution. And even when you're told that the behavior is not freely chosen, people still tend to make the dispositional attribution. That is to say, you automatically accept it at face value. When informed that the target was constrained, the observer should rationally discount the behavioral information, but the observer is tired, distracted, or really doesn't care, and so the secondary shift predicted by Spinoza never takes place. And that fits perfectly with Dan Kahneman's model of the mind in social cognition, where you have System 1 and System 2 processing. System 1 is the quick, effortless acceptance of the information, where System 2 would be the careful, rational analyzing of the information, and that takes cognitive energy, which we don't really want to do, particularly if it goes along with our point of view. In a political argument, for example, if the information that's coming in that's disparaging to our political opponents, it fits with our pre-existing beliefs, then we're not going to be motivated to challenge it. Of course, I think that's partially why conspiracy theories are so easily transmitted. So what Dan Gilbert did, and this is from this model here at the top, the 4 boxes, is from the Gilbert and Malone paper that I asked you to read. What Dan Gilbert did is he built this larger model which makes sense of the weird results in the fundamental attribution error research, and it fits in nicely with social cognitive research of Dan Kahneman. When observing somebody's behavior, the observer needs to first understand the situation, that's this part, then form an expectation about the behavior that is likely to happen, that's this part, then perceive the actor's behavior, you have to actually understand what the actor is doing, that's this part, and then form an attribution about the actor's behavior, being situational or dispositional, so that's your decision making over here. A lot of this is automatic. One of the amazing things about the way that the mind works is that we can form our situational perception and our behavioral expectations in the blink of an eye. Just by very quickly observing the situation and somebody acting within it, we can get to all three of these steps in a split second. And this comes nearly as fast. Although if you're making a decision about it that goes against your preordained or pre-ingrained beliefs, then that might take a little more effort and time. And I think you can apply this same model to things like stereotyping and prejudice. So here's an example. You see somebody speaking who is extremely nervous. And Mark Snyder did, University of Minnesota, Minneapolis did a study like this. If you see somebody speaking who is extremely nervous, you first need to assess the situation. So you need to examine what's going on. So the person speaking being nervous, that's this part, the perception. You need to assess the situation, that's also part of the first stage. Then form an expectation about what it would be like to be in that situation. That's the behavioral expectation. How would it feel to me being in that specific situation? That's that's the development of the expectation. And then you observe the target's behavior and compare it to your expectation of the behavior. And then based on whether the person is behaving in a way that is consistent with or not consistent with your behavioral expectation, you make an attribution. So if you see somebody who's speaking who's extremely nervous, I think most people would make a dispositional attribution, even in light of the person being in a situation that is sufficient to elicit being nervous. Now imagine speaking in front of a medium-sized crowd, 20 people, being in front of a medium-sized classroom. Is that sufficient to make most people nervous? Well, I think there's a tendency to underestimate how nerve-wracking that can be for the observer until the observer gets up and starts to talk. And that's the thing about these social forces, they're invisible until you get up in front of the stage, and then you feel those social forces very keenly. So there's, I think, a tendency to underestimate the situational factors involved in causing behavior, and I think that's sort of common. And because of that underestimation of the power of the situation, there's often a mismatch between our expectation and the perception that we have of the person acting. We underestimate how much they're reacting to the situation, and that's why we make dispositional attributions. At least that's one explanation. Now, what if you knew that the actor was saying something that was very, very embarrassing in front of a very large group of people? Now, those are two different factors that by themselves would be sufficient to cause embarrassment and nervousness. So with that overwhelming amount of data, that the person was nervous because of the situation, that I think would overcome the fundamental attribution error, and the person would go ahead and make a situational attribution. And sometimes I think that's what it takes, really overwhelming evidence of a situational explanation for people to make situational attributions for somebody else's behavior. Sometimes it is that hard. Gilbert and Malone also identified two highly relevant issues related to this model, about how people use the model. And this is at box 1. They also identified some other ones, but to my mind, these are really two of the most important ones. The impediments to going through the model and coming up with a situational attribution. The first of these is the invisibility problem. Observers are usually unaware of the social forces pushing actors to behave in ways that they do. The social forces themselves are invisible to the observer. We don't feel it the way that the person who's acting feels it. We underestimate the strength and the value of those social forces because we're not experiencing them directly. And then the construal problem. Even if the observer becomes aware of social forces pushing on an actor, the actor may interpret the meaning of the social forces very differently than the observer does. Perhaps the actor perceives the audience as hostile, but the observer does not. So, there's a whole lot of individual factors that go into play here. The person who's standing in front of a classroom giving a talk, imagine a student giving a 10-minute talk in front of a class. If the student is thinking that everybody is critically assessing me, then that gives a different level of meaning than it does to the observers who don't have that same cognition. So that there are individual differences here that are going to come into play. And the observer can construe the situation and the situational forces quite differently than the actor does. So both of those were at the first box, the perception of the situation and its forces on the actor. At the second box, we may underestimate the power of the situation to elicit the behavior from us. So when you're, as an observer, when you're watching somebody do something, and you're trying to decide, well, what is the power of that situation to cause a behavior? How would I react in the same situation? At that point, we can underestimate the power of the situation to affect us directly. I think this is probably very common, that we overestimate our individuality and our ability to stand up for what we believe because we're not directly feeling those social forces at the moment. As Gilbert and Malone note, we're constantly surprised, and by we, I think they mean just society in general, people in psychology when they learn about these studies. We're constantly surprised by the behavior of the Zimbardo prison subjects and the Milgram obedience subjects. These are typically very surprising to students. I mean, I've shown the Milgram obedience film many, many, many times in classes, and people, even if they've seen it before, they're shocked at the behavior of the subjects in the film. And according to Gilbert and Malone, this is shocking to us precisely because we have a tendency to underestimate the invisible power of social forces to make us act in ways contrary to our wishes. We underestimate this because we think that we will stand up. If we are in that situation, we think that we will stand up to those forces differently. So there's a different behavioral expectation because you're outside of the situation. You overestimate your competency in dealing with those problems. At the third box, errors can happen because the observer tends to have an inflated expectation about what the actor should do in that situation. All of these are related to each other, of course. And so here, with the Milgram obedience study, the expectation is that no one would ever do anything so unethical because they would stand up for what is right. But this expectation is only valid if you first correctly estimate the power of the social forces at work. So if you, this one, what we're talking about here, this conclusion here is only valid if you've made the correct assessments at these stages, but we tend not to. And so we underestimate the social forces, and at the end, our conclusion tends to be a dispositional attribution. At the fourth box, we make those attributions after considering the previous steps, but the Spinozan error happens at this stage, according to Gilbert, when the observer is too lazy, tired, or distracted to focus on the situational causes. So you're not actively engaged in a rational examination of the situational forces and their power, and so you automatically accept the dispositional attribution as sort of the default. In the Spinozan model of the mind, the default setting is to believe ambiguous input until it is refuted. With attributions, the default is to assume a dispositional attribution until situational factors can be fully addressed. But you have to actually want to do that. You have to be motivated. That's the key thing. And under what conditions can we be motivated to look for a situational factor? If it, perhaps if it fits with our pre-existing beliefs. So it becomes sort of like a biased social cognition. And so this is where this line of research is heading. In the past 10 years or so, there's been some really interesting research. A lot of it is by Linda Skitka, University of Illinois in Chicago. And so in a relatively new twist, research has shown that people can be motivated to make situational attributions, and that those motivations are frequently linked to political ideology, although they don't have to be. But some of the research has shown that it is, that it can be. And this is referred to as the motivated correction hypothesis. So a little bit about conservative differences between conservatives and liberals. Here's a study by John Jost, Glaser, Kruglansky, and Soloway from 2003 in Psychological Bulletin. They did a meta-analysis of attributes comparing liberals versus conservatives. And this is across 88 studies. Meta-analysis combines the effect size of different studies. I won't go into a lot of detail on this. I just want to point a couple things out. So 88 different studies. And the total sample size included in all of these 88 studies was 22,818. Probably a lot of these were studies using college students. So it's not a perfect sampling technique, but that's what's available, and that's it's a rather old study, 17 years old now. At any rate, conservatives were found to be more dogmatic, more inflexible, more intolerant of ambiguity, lower on integrative complexity. We saw that with some of the other research that I cited in part 1 of this lecture. Lower on sensation seeking, lower on valuing broad-mindedness. A lot of these are linked to the big five. Openness to new experiences in particular. Lower openness to new experiences. Negative preference for new music, which is part of new experiences. Disliked ambiguous literary text. I guess they don't like Faulkner very much. Need for structure and order and closure. Greater perception of the world as a dangerous place. More likely to convert to authoritarian churches through an economic threat. It's a weird one. And I will say this about the study. I think the research that went into this study, the different 88 different studies that went into this meta-analysis. I mean, it sort of seems like they were pulling on variables that would tend to make conservatives look bad. There are probably a lot of other differences between conservatives and liberals where the differences would be more positive among conservatives, like valuing security, for example. Now, that is something that's been tested, and conservatives value this more. But security in society is a very important thing. So that's, you can say that it's. I think you can say that it's positive. Now, I don't think we need to focus on this too much, but I just wanted to point out that there are some regular, predictable differences between those who identify in terms of their political ideology as being liberal or conservative. And there's a whole lot of really more interesting research since 2003, particularly by Haidt, H-A-I-D-T. And among Haidt's different works, that's Jonathan Haidt, I would recommend his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And he looks at both sides of that issue, in terms of the differences between liberals and conservatives cutting both ways. I'm not going to go over his research here because it would take about 10 lectures to get through it all. But one thing I do want to point out is that these things, in turn, can be transitory and linked to current events. That is to say, they're not ingrained in personality in a way that cannot be changed. They change a little bit based on what's going on in the situational environment. After September 11th, researchers looked at this, and for the Nail and McGregor study, they were fortunate in the sense that they had taken some political attitude data from a sample, and they were going to be doing it again, and 9/11 happened in the interim. So it's a longitudinal study. They've got testing data from before 9/11 and after 9/11. So they can see how the political ideology of these same participants changed over time. Now, I was in New York City on 9/11. In fact, I was in close proximity to the World Trade Center when it toppled. I was in the subway when it came down. And, it was really, really it had such a dramatic impact on people in New York City. There was a malaise that crept over. Everybody knew somebody who died, or, everybody knew somebody who knew somebody. It was very closely felt. And one of the things that happened is that researchers in New York City collected a lot of data in the weeks after 9/11 of people walking down the street to get attitudes. So there is some very interesting research in that area. But this is one that I think is useful to show that what we're looking at in terms of the attitudes of conservatives and liberals can change based on current events. So the liberals, down here the squares, the liberals are squares, and the conservatives triangles. The liberals got more conservative after 9/11 on your y-axis here, where this is conservative and this is liberal. And so it's not entirely based on personality. It can shift to some extent. You can, based on what you expose a person to, you can highlight their affiliation to some extent. You're not going to totally flip it, but you can make certain things resonate more. And I put together this table to highlight some things that are going to come into play in the final couple of studies I want to talk about here in this lecture. So in terms of considering motivated social cognitions, we need to have a couple of definitions in place. And so I picked a couple of values that are linked to being conservative or liberal. And other people can argue about this. I don't want to argue about it, but one of the key values I think linked to conservatism is individualism or self-sufficiency, and one of the key values linked to liberalism is egalitarianism or fairness for all. So if you follow this through, if individualism is a value, how does that look in practice? Individualism or self-sufficiency in practice would be the Protestant work ethic. Hard work gets you positive things, such as in the extreme form in Lutheranism, hard work actually gets you rich and gets you to heaven. And so if you're examining an issue such as poverty, why is it, you ask your subjects in an experiment, why is it that the person is living in poverty? The conservative may make a dispositional attribution that they're not working hard enough. So the outcome here is that the poor are blamed for being in poverty, and in terms of public policy, there's a tendency to want to cut public funds for the safety net, social services, and things like that that will provide funds for those who are out of work. Whereas with liberalism, if we're considering one of the linked values as egalitarianism or fairness for all, that value in practice you can say is humanism, which is society helps those who cannot help themselves, and the attribution for considering why is it that this person is in poverty. The person here, the participant in such a study, might be more apt to make a situational attribution. Well, they're poor because they've had hard luck in life, and they haven't been able to get out of that situation. So the poor are viewed with empathy, and there's support for funds to help improve the lives of the poor. So we have two different outcomes based on the core ideology, leading through these routes to a dispositional attribution to explain why is it that the person who's being described in the experiment isn't living in poverty, where the conservative makes a dispositional attribution and the liberal makes a situational attribution. Now, there have been years of studies of asking people to give explanations for why people are living in poverty, what we should do about it, and typically the findings have been that conservatives make dispositional attributions and liberals make situational attributions. And so one of the beliefs, or one of the, I guess you can say, one of the perceived trends in this line of research was that it's very hard to get conservatives to make situational attributions. So the question sort of arose, do conservatives ever make situational attributions? And do liberals ever make dispositional attributions? So enter the research by Skitka. This is really her line of research, Linda Skitka. In this particular paper, she's working with colleagues Morgan and Mullen. And it's a very interesting study. You've got 2 or 3 different experiments within it. 2010. So they're talking about a massacre that happened in Iraq that was committed by American forces, and depending on the scenario, people are randomly assigned to be told that it was the Marines who committed the massacre, or they're told that it was Halliburton employees, that is to say mercenaries, who committed the atrocity, where what was a couple dozen Iraqis were killed. Something I don't recall the details. And you have the political ideology down here, liberal versus conservative. And so the situational attribution is based on an assessment of how much the subjects felt that the troops in question were under pressure and fearful of their lives and so forth. So if you make a dispositional attribution, it should be lower, situational attribution higher. And so we see that the conservatives are making a situational attribution for the Marines, but they're making a more dispositional attribution for Halliburton employees. Now that's really very interesting. So they're flip-flopping depending on who did the killing. The liberals, there's not a whole lot of difference between the views here. And I should say, while significant, the differences here are kind of small. They did this with several different vignettes. We see, well, this is one of mine. So in this one, this is the gay panic defense. So let's see. That was kind of a rough segue. But this was a study that I got interested in because I had done an interview with a reporter once about the use of the gay panic defense. I was teaching mental health law. And I knew of the defense, but I had not really read about it. So I did some reading and pulled up some cases from LexisNexis, and I found quite a large number of cases where defendants had used the gay panic defense in response to being caught having murdered somebody. And, the claim is, well, the guy came on to me sexually and I had a panic attack and so I killed him. It's a very flimsy defense, and it's not going to get the person off in terms of not serving prison time, but the hope of the defendant or the defendant's attorney is that if you're successful, you'll get manslaughter instead of murder. So on the y-axis, you have the proportion of subjects voting for murder from 0% to 100%. This is essentially frequency data. And then what I did is I had a 4-point scale asking the subjects to rate themselves on liberal, moderate, conservative, or conservative. I used to ask people if they were extreme conservative, extreme liberal, but I gave up on that because nobody ever thinks of themselves as being extreme. Even the people who are really pronounced extremists see themselves as being, close to the center, which is kind of weird. But so we have 3 different cases, and each subject got each of these 3 cases, so that part is a within subjects design. You have a murder that's committed out of jealousy. A man killed his ex-wife at a bar after he sees her dancing with somebody else. A murder that's committed out of fear. A man finds out where the drug dealers are hiding their stash. This is at a housing complex in a large city in the vignette. And he steals the drug dealer's stash in order to buy a gift for his girlfriend, finds out that the drug dealers are onto him, and he buys a gun instead and shoots the dealer in a preemptive strike. So it's the murder is out of fear. And then the gay panic one, where a guy kills another guy after, in the vignette, the victim made a sexual advance. So what we see here is, the way that I'm interpreting this is that the proportion of subjects voting for murder, that's a dispositional attribution, that the person is a bad person, needs to be charged with a top charge. Whereas if you see the extenuating circumstances of this provocation defense, then that is essentially a situational attribution. So at least that's how I'm interpreting this. And there's an interesting pattern here among the conservatives, but only for the gay panic case. You see that the more conservative, and it doesn't matter if they're moderate or full conservatives, they are giving more manslaughter convictions rather than murder convictions to the defendant. So essentially what they're doing, these conservative participants are making situational attributions because it aligns with their values. That is to say, they're motivated to see the situational forces at work. And you don't see that for the other cases. The other cases based on fear or jealousy do not trigger this motivated social cognition. And so we got significant effects up here, but I'm only really interested in this one. The simple effects test comparing this mean versus this mean. Highly significant. And then back to the Morgan, Mullen, and Skitka paper. What they propose is that you have political orientation at the root, and liberals and conservatives will resonate with different themes. So conservatives will resonate with security values, whereas liberals will resonate with environmental values. They did a different version of the study using a tiger had escaped from the zoo and the police had to shoot it. The liberals looked for, that particular one resonated with the liberals. So you have different pathways for different political orientations, which lead you in turn to situational attributions. So the conservatives are going to go this pathway in order to get to the situational attribution if it's a security value in play. Whereas the liberals are going to go through environmental values. So if you identify the different types of values linked to conservatism and liberalism, then you can determine in advance whether they're going to have an impact in motivated social cognition to get them to a situational attribution. And, it sounds really basic and at this point even simplistic, but voila, we've explained so much of why it is today in the United States that, politically speaking, conservatives and liberals seem to be living in two totally different realities and seeing the same thing happen and coming to totally different conclusions about it. It's because of the motivated social cognition that takes you away from a dispositional attribution and toward a situational attribution. I can't underestimate how important I think this is. I think it goes a very long way to explaining a lot of the tension along political ideological fault lines that we see today. And so that's my lecture. That's it for today. I'm going to go get some rest. Have a good day.